So, welcome everybody, and this is a really great Privacy Kitchen. Super excited. We've got Chris Taylor, Head of Assurance at the UK ICO, joining us. You'll have seen we did a short video about the UK ICO's accountability framework with 5 pros and 5 cons. We did a great video interview with Tash Whitaker about how it's used by her in practice as well. And obviously, Chris is a fantastic aspect on this as well. So, without further ado, Chris, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Certainly, yes. And hi, Robert. So I'm head of assurance at ICO, and I look after a range of different things that we do that's all around supporting upstream compliance. So the accountability framework that Robert's just discussed, but I also look after our kind of guidance, our core guidance outputs to people, the guide to GDPR. I've done work in the past setting up our regulatory sandbox. I also look after our work on GDPR codes of conduct and certification schemes, and some of our statutory codes of practice as well, so journalism and marketing.
That's fantastic. So really embedded in from the sort of grassroots up of how do people actually implement this? How do people operationalize privacy and the tools there? And I think the UK ICO is justifiably well known around the world for the practicality of the guides as well. So thank you very much for that. Now I will ask a couple of tough questions. So this isn't going to be totally sort of smooth, but so starting off with the accountability framework, with the different background you've got there, the different projects you've been doing. So what drove the ICO to go, okay, let's create this sort of gold standard 338 question accountability framework?
Sure. So you can trace the origins of the accountability framework back to the accountability principle in GDPR. And everyone, I'm sure your readers and listeners will all be familiar with the underpinning accountability principle. Essentially, our previous commissioner in our last strategic plan recognised that actually organisations knowing what they need to do to be able to demonstrate their compliance is quite a challenge. And knowing practically what things does this actually mean I have to put in place, particularly when you're working with the principles-based legislation, knowing what are the practical things I need to do to manage my compliance. So we had a commitment in our last strategy to, at a high level, create and support and foster a culture of accountability in data controllers and in processes. And one of the commitments we made then was to develop essentially a privacy management framework that people could pick up, use, adapt, in order to actually understand what does it mean to demonstrate my accountability, what does it mean to have good privacy management in practice. So that was the genesis for it. Absolutely.
I mean, you've hit on so many things I want to ask questions about as well there. So you talked about adapt there as well, and accountability for me also. So my background was general counsel in VC-backed SaaS. So the accountability for me was two ways. It was how do we show the board, the internal stakeholders, and then also how do we, as an organization, show the external stakeholders? And I think the framework's really good for both of those. And I think I'd be interested to hear when we get onto the intent about how much it's intended for internal use and how much it's also intended for accountability externally. So are you, obviously the ICO is still very much involved with collaboration with, let's say that, with European regulators in the EU and EEA on data protection. Are you aware of other work on similar broad GDPR accountability frameworks in other regulators in Europe? Are they looking at this? How are they seeing the UK ICO's accountability framework?
So the international dimension to this is interesting. I'm not aware of other DPAs doing a product exactly like the accountability framework in that breadth and in that depth. There are obviously other privacy management frameworks out there. Yes. In fact, there are many privacy management frameworks out there, both by individual consultants, but people might also be familiar with the Privacy Information Management Standard that BSI are involved with and responsible for. So there are lots of different frameworks out there. And that was part of the context in which we were developing our framework, was thinking, given the existence of those things, how does our framework actually play out? How does it influence those other frameworks, and how might people work with it? Internationally, we've had some interest in it, I think it's fair to say. Particularly, actually, we were really happy that I think last year it won an award at the Global Privacy Awards, Global Privacy Assembly Awards. Yeah. So make sure I've got to get that in.
Absolutely.
But there was definitely, I think, some recognition there of the practical guidance we were trying to provide to people who just want to understand what are the steps that I need to have in place. But I confess I've not come across one like it provided by a DPA particularly.
And that's why I ask, because I've not either. And I think this should, I do hear interest in the different chat I'm in terms of sort of Signal and WhatsApp and stuff and all the different groups. There's a lot of interest from outside the UK in the framework, because it is pretty well the only one. And actually, it's quite good to just have one, because otherwise you don't want sort of, 338 questions in the UK and a totally different 338 questions in France, for example. So it doesn't surprise me at all. And in terms of, there's a couple of bits from this. So absolutely, we in Keepable, we have our own benchmark that we created against GDPR and PECR. It's more strategic level, it's sort of 80 odd questions. And we just brought the accountability framework into the product because consultants and customers were going, this is what we use. And what you mentioned earlier about there are other benchmarks, there are like 27701 and what have you, and like ours and other providers and NIST and what have you. However, being the DPA, it's like in one of the videos we got, there's 5 pros and cons. The 2 biggest pros are it's a safe harbor for the consultant or the individual looking after privacy, and for the organization if they're benchmarking against the official gold standard from the regulator. Which brings me on to a question is, are you aware at all, I know it's potentially different teams and what have you, about how the ICO feels when they go in to talk to somebody and they're using the benchmark compared to not? Like, does that make a big difference?
I think the first thing we say is that, the accountability framework sets out what we see as being good practice in privacy management. Any action that we always take will always be grounded in the underpinning legislation rather than the use of our particular tools. So realistically, this framework is operating very much in the support to organizations space. And it's primarily in that context that it will be used. We might point organizations at it in our dealings with them if they're looking to enhance their practices or if they're looking to improve how they're going about privacy management. But it's not something that would be the starting point necessarily for an investigation or for a case. It's very much operating in the promoting upstream compliance space and just trying to help people comply with their obligations.
Totally makes sense. And we'll come back to some of those points as well. I just wanted to move on to the reception of it in the market. So just a quote from the website, from the ICO's website. The accountability framework can help any organization, whether small or large, with their obligations. The key is that the measures you put in place must be appropriate, risk-based, and proportionate. If you work for a smaller organization, you'll most likely benefit in first instance from resources in our SME hub, including the data protection self-assessment toolkit. I'm a big fan of those ones as well. So in terms of that context from the intent of use, how have you found it, your feedback on how it's used in the market in terms of size of company, the industry? Is it by consultants? Is it by the organizations themselves? Is it by no one, by everyone? Because I've heard some different stuff, which I'll say after. I'd like to hear how you see it, actually, how it's being used in the market.
So similar perspective, really. I think where we've had the most kind of clear uptake and feedback on its use has been from organizations that have got, I'm trying to give a good way of putting this, the kind of a developed approach to privacy management to a certain extent already. And they're looking to, like, benchmark or compare what they're doing, evolve what they're doing. I think realistically, it's unlikely that someone who is starting out on day one of their compliance journey would pick up the accountability framework and just start implementing it, because realistically, it is meant to be a tool that we hope people will adapt, apply to their area, and then consider how to make it relevant to them. And actually, for organisations that are perhaps very immature in their privacy journey, there are other products that are probably a better place to start, like the kind of checklists that we've referenced. And it could be that then, in time, as they enhance what they do and as they develop their approach, then the privacy management accountability framework becomes probably a bit more relevant to them.
I can see that, and I can also see actually doing both. So, for example, I can see for me the accountability framework is quite. As it says on the website, broadly done for as a broad application as possible. And as you say, you've mentioned adaptation quite a lot. We'll come back to that. And so what I like about the data protection toolkit is the self-assessment toolkit is there's very sort of actionable things in each of those checklists, I think, are a really good thing. So doing both is actually also, in my mind, quite an interesting one. So let's talk about the adaptation bit, because one of the things that I've heard a fair bit, but also came through very strongly in the Tash Whitaker interview that we did, is that And from the website as well, you let me just go to the there's no one size fits all approach. It's not sector specific. You're going to come out with case studies highlighting experience across different sectors, different sized organizations, etc. So it is intended to be taken on and sort of adapted and used by the organization. So that's a really big thing, I think, because out there's also a little bit of a feeling of, well, that's not applicable to me. Do you know what I mean? So one of the things Tash and I talked about was in terms of the oversight, that you have an oversight committee with then operational committees feeding into the oversight committee that feeds into the board. And if you're like a 100-person company, you probably don't have that structure in place. And so you adapt it. So are you happy? It sounds like the intent was that people would go, well, I can't quite exactly do that, but for me in my industry or my size, I can do this. And so I'm going to say yes.
I mean, broadly speaking, yes. When you look at the accountability framework, you'll see that it's intended as a layered framework.
Yeah.
So we make distinctions between what we call our expectations and then ways to meet expectations. Yeah. And I think the ways to meet expectations is the kind of things that we might expect people to have in place. But realistically, it's the high level expectation that is the thing that is most likely to be indicative of really good practice. And the ways to meet expectations are what we might expect to find in any typical organization. Now, what is a typical organization? There's no such thing as a typical organization. So it would be a starting point for a conversation in your organization about, well, this is the high level expectation that ICO is articulating as what good practice looks like in this area. These are some ways that they've identified we might be able to meet that expectation. Does this work for us? And if it does, not great. If it doesn't, well, let's still have a think about how we meet that overarching expectation. But there might be ways that are more appropriate for us, depending on the type of organization we are and the kind of processing that we're involved with.
Thank you for that. I think that's going to be really helpful for people. It's going to take a lot of the fear away, because also there's obviously the UK, you've come on Privacy Kitchen. It's been fantastic with your colleagues organizing this. The ICO is very much it's a very reasonable regulator, very approachable, and so, but there is a fear that of any sort of touch point. And I think using the ICO accountability framework, some people sort of thinking, I have to have this. So it's been great to have confirmation of that tailoring that can go on. Great. So in terms of how people get into it and tackle it, we talked about who it's applicable to and this sort of thing. Any tips on how people can start addressing it when they want to?
Absolutely. So, I mean, obviously there's quite a lot of information and content in there. And people will be at different stages on their compliance journey as to how it's going. So taking it a bit at a time is entirely sensible and appropriate. You could choose to have a particular focus on one particular area over a period of time, then move on to others. So it's all in keeping with the intention of it being an adaptable tool that can be used as ways that best suit organizations.
Fantastic. I think that's really, really helpful for viewers. Thank you. And so another question is about e-privacy rules and PECR. Now, the framework, correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically a GDPR framework, which is obviously the main part of the privacy elephant, I always call it. It's like the bulk of the privacy elephant is GDPR, and a big back leg is PECR. What about PECR and how do you see that interacting with the framework?
Sure. So, like as you rightly say, it's primarily focused. Well, it is focused on UK GDPR and the implementation thereof. It's not impossible in the future. We might consider extending it, both not just thinking about things like PECR, but also thinking about Part 3 and Part 4 processing or other areas. There's always the potential for that to develop. At the moment, just reflecting on some of the earlier things we were talking about around the changing context, changing legislative reform agenda, I think they will all be things that are in the mix for prioritising our activity over the next year or two and thinking about where we might need to focus our energies. So nothing in the works at the moment, but who knows for the future.
Fantastic. And I think the data protection self-assessment toolkit has a checklist on marketing in there, which is really good. Yeah. And I've had discussions with people talking about like Spinal Tap, turning it to 11, putting another tab on the sheet and having like e-privacy in there. I think one of the things about it, though, it's quite interesting is if it's not just GDPR, if it goes into the national e-privacy, then in a way, people go, well, what about the e-privacy in France or in Germany? Because it's a different one. Whereas the benefit of having it, I actually think there's a really good benefit of having it just UK GDPR, because it's a big beast anyway, big part of that privacy elephant. And actually the privacy bit can get you into conversations and accountability aspects where maybe it's better being dealt with it separately, and a similar one, maybe build out the privacy one separately, the e-privacy one separately. But so are there, in terms of the feedback that you're getting, and this sort of takes us on a bit into where we're going to go forwards. Actually, I'll leave that one just for the moment. We'll come back to how it's used in practice and a typical sort of opening score. So when we were talking with Tash, she suggested a typical opening score could be in that sort of 16 to 20% range. And when people do our Keepable benchmark, it's about the same sort of range. And then it's quite hard, I've heard from quite a few different people, to get over 80% on the accountability framework. Whereas say on our one that's 80 odd questions strategic, you can get 100. It's, you know, it's a different type of different purpose. On the accountability framework, the 338 questions, and it's a very comprehensive commitment. I've heard quite a lot that it's hard to get over 80%. How do you feel on that? And in terms of what would you say to people about, should they aim for 100? Is 80 okay? How do you look at it in terms of, well, you've not done so well on that bit, you're doing well on that bit? Can you talk a bit about the scores that you are happy with and you'd look to see?
So I think, sorry, excuse me again. I think it's all, you know, to a large extent, context specific. Worth coming back to the primary purpose of this is to assist people in enhancing their compliance practice. Yeah. So I think it would be quite foolish of me to sort of say, oh, well, you know, we would expect everybody to get 95% or 93%, because realistically, I mean, first and foremost, anyone that works in the privacy space will know that compliance is not something that is just done and completed and you're 100% and it's over, right? It's always a developing process. Yep. Use whatever metaphor you like, painting the fourth bridge, whatever. Yep. You know, it is a continual process that goes on. And as people's businesses evolve, as their processing evolves, new compliance issues will come into view, and other ones will go away, as will the approach to management that they take. So I think I would encourage people to sort of engage with it openly, constructively, and almost to a certain extent, not be overly concerned or fixated on the numerical score that comes out at the end, because realistically, what is important is that people obviously are compliant with the legislation, but that they're using it as a way to improve and enhance their practice. So, you know, somebody that starts at 20% and develops and builds beyond that, that's good in terms of enhancing our compliance, you know, outcomes. Similarly, if people are hitting 70, 80%, that's fantastic as well. I think we're just keen to see it out there used and helping to improve compliance. It's certainly not something that we look at from a kind of hard numerical perspective ourselves.
And that's great to hear as well. That people were very happy about that. And this brings us on to the slings and arrows section of the agenda, where the ICO gets a lot of slings and arrows. Now, this might be too politically a hot potato question, but so on the website it says, you say, not you, the ICO says, accountability is not about ticking boxes. While there's some accountability measures you must take, such as doing a DPIA for high-risk processing, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to consider the organization, what you're doing with the personal data to manage personal data risks appropriately. As a general rule, the greater the risk, the more robust and comprehensive the measures in place should be, which is everyone who's as a practitioner in data protection. Yes, absolutely, absolutely fantastic. So how does it feel when you hear statements about, well, GDPR is just a tick box exercise and this framework is just a tick box exercise? Well, how would you respond to those sort of, you know, by providing this, you're encouraging a tick box approach?
I think it's a really interesting challenge, actually, and it's a challenge that, as a principles-based it's a challenge that a regulator dealing with the principle-based regulation is going to have across a whole range of our guidance products, where people are often rightly asking us for greater specificity, greater certainty over how we'll address particular issues and how we'll deal with particular topics, whilst also wanting to preserve the flexibility, proportionality, and risk-based approach that's intended within the legislation to start off with. So we're across all of our guidance products, we're always operating in that space. What we're trying to do with the accountability framework was provide a product, and this is not a scientific description, but that is operating somewhere in the middle, that is providing greater certainty, greater clarity to people about what good privacy management practice looks like, but that still recognises that it will need to be flexed, it will need to be adapted depending on the nature of what you're doing, and that obviously compliance is fundamentally judged against the legislation rather than the rather than the tools that we provide.
But
it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and you could imagine a world in which there was far greater granularity of detail that went on beyond what is in the accountability framework at this stage. But I think we have to be very careful as a regulator also to not essentially create soft regulation by accident. We are still looking to support economic growth, support innovation, make sure that we recognise the flexibility and diversity of the entirety of our regulatory waterfront, as it were. So it was trying to get a judgment of getting a guidance product in that space, basically.
And so, I mean, I put that as a sort of devil's advocate question, because I do totally think that when people say, "Oh," so I put a global group through 27001 about a decade ago, and one of the founders was going, "No, it's just a tick box exercise. You can just pay a dodgy auditor and backfill your paperwork," and away it goes. Well, you can, but we're not going for it in that way. And actually, this is a way to do it and to prove to others. So I think anything can be a tick box exercise. It's not about what it is. It's about how people approach it. And so for me, that's the big thing. So I don't think it's a tick box exercise at all. I think it's supremely helpful and fantastic. Now,
and if I may, I mean, it's one of the reasons why. It's one of the reasons why when we were scoping what the framework would actually look like, we settled on having more than one kind of product within it. So people will be familiar with the fact that there's kind of almost like a traditional nested guidance element to it, which is traditional web content. There's a downloadable spreadsheet, and then there's a reporting tool. And with these things, of course, there are always enhancements and improvements can be made to functionality, navigation, how pretty it looks. Sometimes hard limited by what's possible. But that was definitely some of the thinking around why we've got multiple products, recognizing that there will be different users for this. There'll be some people who want to have that ability to create a score and track their progress over time. There's some folk who want to dip into guidance. And then there'll be some probably people who will just want a spreadsheet they can download, take it, work on it, and adapt it.
I think that's so right. And I think absolutely. So for listeners, there's the full sort of guidance online, which is sort of just information and a guide to each of these areas that includes that same 10 categories, and then within the categories, the expectations, and then the statements and questions. Then there's the online self-assessment, which is just against the expectations. As you mentioned earlier, the expectations is like the core bit, but it doesn't then have that third level of the different questions and stuff. Then there's the accountability tracker, the Excel, which is what we've brought into Keepable, which is the 338 questions bit with the 10 categories, all the different expectations, and then all the different questions. And I think having it like that, and when we talk about the accountability framework with people in the industry, everybody means the Excel version, basically.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, because it's like they want that scoring, they want that dashboard to show. And so actually talking about accountability and which one they use and how they show it, let's go back to that accountability bit we said at the beginning. How much of so the way that we see it being used is very internal. So an organization will be using this internally, whether themselves or with a consultant, and it's to show the team where they're going, what they need to focus on. They can also show the board. Sometimes they'll tailor it up as well, the reporting. And then they're not showing it externally. It's a bit like showing a pen test report. You don't want, it's sort of, well, we'll tell you we've done one and we'll tell you we're doing the stuff. But if we show you this, then it's a bit sort of a breach of security almost in itself. So what was the intent and how do you see it about the accountability framework being used internally for the accountability part and for external accountability part?
I think, speaking really honestly and frankly, we had primarily envisaged it as it is now, by the sounds of what you're saying, how it's being viewed, which is largely as an internal process, document, framework to engage with and to help people develop their privacy management approaches. I don't think we certainly wasn't from a user design perspective designed as something that we would expect organizations to display publicly in the way that we've provided it, because there will be all sorts of design considerations around that we as the regulator wouldn't be best placed to try and second guess.
I mean, I'm aware that people are taking a spreadsheet and they're creating their own stuff as well off the back of it, and as I say, we've implemented it as well, and different people will. I think as your role as a regulator to provide that guidance, it's like job done, big tick, and then other people can then run with it and do it in different ways and what have you. But so I told that's brilliant that it matches the intention, and that brings us to the the expectations part, it sounds like you're pretty happy with how it's gone down in the market. Has it met your expectations before you released it?
Yes, I mean, I think so. We had good feedback during the consultation exercises that we ran on it around whether it met external users' expectations, and I think I seem to remember a score of about 70 or 80% in terms of it meeting external users' perceptions when we did our consultation. Although I would need to go back and double check the numbers on that. And in terms of anecdotally, what we see is the kind of feedback that you've been talking about. We hear it being discussed by DPOs quite a lot in terms of its use, and obviously some of the downsides to it as well. We have got some case studies on our website now about organisations that have taken it and used it, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying because they're on our website. So University of Cambridge Intercollegiate Services is one. DEFRA have made use of it. I know it's been of quite a lot of interest to government departments generally as looking at how to approach privacy. And from anecdotes, I remember as they were setting up the new biosecurity centre, I think there was reference to them using that as a starting point for their privacy management approaches as well. So I think we're getting kind of good, consistent, strong anecdotal feedback that it's playing an important role for people in helping them in the kind of ways that you've been describing. And it continues to get good engagement online. And all the kind of survey work we did on it during its development indicated that it was, I generalize, broadly in the right space. So I think on the whole we're happy with it. We're happy with how it's gone.
Brilliant. I mean, you mentioned quite a lot of sort of public sector feedback there and users there, and I can totally from the private sector side say, I mean, in the interview with Tash, this is online. The interview with Tash said she uses it with all of her customers in any industry, any size. She doesn't always tell them she's using it, but she'll use it with them, and then she'll maybe introduce it to them later on at the right time. Yeah. And others I've spoken to, other DPOs as well, they said they just use it with everybody. So and I think the big reason is it is that gold standard regulator framework. You can't be sacked for hiring IBM. You can't. You're using the official thing. So it's a good one, and it does. As you say, that adaptability and taking time to look at how it applies to you, I think, is a really key thing. So one of the things I'm interested in as well, because we've just built it into the product, and as an indication of the demand, people love it. It's really generated a lot of stuff, but the people are loving it. But you mentioned there'll be an annual review of the content of the framework as well. So obviously, we've just built it into the product. So what are the plans going forward in terms of taking the feedback that you've had, implementing it? And this, I want to just add a second question, because I think it's relevant to put the two together. The DPDI bill come through, the sort of UK Brexit reform, UK GDPR Brexit reform bit. How relevant do you see that being, and how is that impacting your roadmap for the accountability framework?
All really good questions, and to be honest, I think again, speaking completely openly, I think they're questions that we're working through at ICO at the moment in terms of the impacts that it could potentially have across all ranges of our activity. To take the first bit of the question first about the annual review, people who followed the development of the accountability framework might be aware already that the content of the accountability framework has come from our experience supervising the regulation, not just since GDPR came in, but also our experience prior to that as well. And actually, one of the key sources of information within it are some of the toolkits that our own audit teams use when we're going out and auditing organisations. So we want to try and make sure that there's regulatory kind of consistency between what we tell people externally and what our teams look at when they go and undertake audit work externally. Yeah. So with the annual review, actually, as it happens, in the most recent time when we considered this, which was at the start of the year, we decided not to make any changes to the accountability framework as it stands. That's also because we haven't also made any fundamental changes to our underpinning audit toolkits. And some of that is because we have got an eye on what is happening over the next year or so and wanting to ensure we provide a degree of stability in the kind of expectations that we are articulating externally. So we will only, we're realistically, I think we will only be making changes to the accountability framework where there are really big and obvious substantive reasons to do so. And as it stands at the moment, that we're not in that environment at the moment.
I mean, that sounds, well, first off, that sounds great, because the reason I say it sounds great is I think we've been in a massive state of flux in the UK and uncertainty. As a data protection practitioner, talking about a whole range of different things. And it's good to have certainty in an area, and good to have
as far as we can. Sure.
Yeah, as far as and then we did a side-by-side comparison of the UK GDPR now and the TPDI, and in terms of Article 30 records, it's exactly the same thing. In terms of assessments, it's pretty similar, if not, very similar. In terms, the biggest change probably is the DPO and SRI bit, but actually the SRI has to do all the DPO stuff anyway, and a bit more, as is currently drafted. We'll see what happens to that going forwards. So my take on it is, there won't be a seismic change anyway, because you still need the leadership bit, you still need the training and awareness, you still need the security, you still need the records, you still need risk. All those different 10 categories are all going to basically be there. They're part of every governance program. And the way that it's drafted is such that it's at a level that really, so I often say to people, well, one bit might change on something down there, but at that level, it's not going to change that question.
I think that's a fair sort of summary of the situation. I mean, none of us know, of course, at this stage what the future of DPDI will be or how that will pan out. But I come back to the fact that we've built this on an experience of good information management, good privacy management, going back 10, 15 and more years. So exactly like you say, concepts of training your staff and making them aware of their responsibilities, keeping a record of what data you're processing. These are not things that are solely dependent on the legislation for being good practice in information rights management. Absolutely, where there are changes to the underpinning law, that might make some changes to particular areas within it for sure. But as an overarching suite of good privacy management practices, I would be surprised if there was radical, some kind of a wildly radical different approach.
I agree. So one bit I wanted to ask you was, your team also, if I'm right, you develop and implement the UK ICO's approach to Section 4042, the sort of certifications, codes of conduct, and we put a Privacy Kitchen video up saying 27001 is not GDPR, and that was incredibly so it caused lots of comments on LinkedIn and stuff, and really great conversations around it. And then we did one on 27701, which obviously is an extension to 27001, but only 0.05% of organizations in Europe and the UK have 27001 anyway. So it's 99.9% don't. So they're not going to have 27701 either. We've just had the EDPB come through with the Euro Privacy certification system. So I've always been saying GDPR is its own ISO. It's a set of rules that are risk-based, appropriate, and you've got guidance in recitals, and you've got guidance from the regulators. So it's like a 27001 and 27002 anyway. It's its own sort of standard. Is there a discussion at the ICO of taking it's 338 questions, 10 categories. It basically is a standard. Is there a thought of making that a GDPR standard that can be certified against? Because people are already using it out there. There's no, this is going back to the level of detail as well. I think that one of the things that scares people off, and it could be, as you say, a fourth aspect to it, is because you want to bring people into compliance, and you want to get them improving their compliance and being practical about where people are in the country and how many people want which bit. So if you replaced everything with like an ISO version of the accountability framework, it'd be a disaster, because hardly anyone would use it. But if you had like a fourth version that is, well, this is actually, if you're doing the framework and you want a certification about it, here's a bit more on it. And it wouldn't need actually that much more. I think it stands alone with the guidance and with this framework anyway. I think it's pretty well ready to go. What's your answer to that?
It's a really interesting topic, and there's a number of different dimensions to it. So probably a good place to start is that, in common with our European counterparts, the interpretation we have of certification within GDPR is that it is intended, and in a couple of places explicitly references certification as it relates to product, service and process certification. So that is as distinct from management systems certification. So it explicitly references ISO 17065 as the standard to which accredited certification bodies would need to be accredited in order to deliver certification against DPA agreed certification schemes. So there is an interesting disconnect between an existing certification ecosystem in the kind of 27001, 27701 space, and the interpretation and we think fairly clear interpretation of the legislation that it's intended to be product, service, and process-based certification rather than management system certification. So there are some really interesting conversations that have been had in all sorts of different rooms and in different guises about whether there might be some ability to bridge between management systems-based certification and product, service, and process-based. So,
I mean,
certification. We're definitely
Euro privacy is pretty much a management system, really. I mean, it's quite management system-esque. I mean, you've got to be, you know, and it's so related with the processes as well. And it's, in a way, this could be, it could be a one of the Brexit benefits. Let's say that we could get a UK GDPR standard that is basically the accountability framework with the guidance on the website. There you go, and it's a certifiable one. And it might be outside the realm of GDPR Article 4042. It might be within it, but it might be within it in future. It could be, you know, GDPR is being reviewed all the time. And also people go for 27001 as a proxy anyway. So I don't actually personally think having it as an official GDPR one it's really about how people view it. And if it's an official regulator one, they'll go, wow, well, let's just go for that one. So I think there's a lot of value in that. So how are those conversations going?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's all perfectly reasonable points to discuss. What I would say is that even within 17065 based certification, there are requirements to have appropriate management systems in place. So there isn't a kind of a hard black and white dividing line between these things entirely. There are interconnections between them, and certainly, particularly actually in the realm of Article 40 codes of conduct, we can definitely see how people, particularly in a given sector, might pick up the accountability framework. Make it more sector specific, and then develop that into an Article 40 code of conduct for how a particular sector might approach its particular management on particular topics that are relevant to that sector. So it's a very live discussion.
So I'll throw my tuppence in then for your conversations. I think the codes of conduct, I think the benefit of standards, if you look at ISOs, they're not vertical. They're basically horizontal. No. And I think having the benefit of a set of rules that you apply as appropriate to your organization. You know, you might be doing 27,000 and go, well, we don't have any loading bays. Fantastic. And you can crack on. But, you know, so having a horizontal one like the framework, I think is far more beneficial, because you end up with this splintering into all these different vertical codes of conduct. Everyone's duplicating a whole load of stuff that, frankly, if it was a horizontal one, they can say, well, we've taken this horizontal one and we've implemented it in this way. So, you know, people in, I don't know, transport have 27001, people in finance have 27001, totally different industries. But that's what the standard does. It's the way they've always. So I think that personally, I'm not a major fan of industry code of conduct type aspects, unless there's like, you know, the cloud one, etc. There are certain areas where it might be more strategic, but I wouldn't like to see a massive splintering down into different industries. I think a standard that's horizontal for me is the way to go. But that's just my.
I think that's entirely fair. And you know, ICO has approved 3 certification schemes now that are up and running. So one in the area of age-appropriate design, one in the area of age assurance technologies, and one in the area of asset disposal. And you can absolutely see the kind of cross-sectoral, cross-organizational application of those really important kind of process within multiple different jurisdictions, sectors, types of applications. So I think I genuinely think there's a room for all of these devices. And sometimes the reality is that the market in the broadest sense will be key to delivering what actually works. So what's interesting is that we've got 3 certification schemes approved, and I think potentially more on the way fairly shortly. Codes of conduct have yet to actually emerge within the UK, although I do think there will be some coming as well. And because sectors are constituted in particular ways, the types of processing they're dealing with are in particular ways, the challenges they're trying to address in particular sectors can vary. These different mechanisms are there and are available depending on exactly what is the compliance challenge that's being looked to be resolved. So I think
I agree with that, but I think there's 2 conversations. I always sort of simplify it down into 2 conversations in terms of with security, as I say, 0.05% of organizations that pay VAT in Europe and the UK have 27001. So statistically, it's irrelevant from that point of view, but it's really, really impactful, and everyone aligns. We've got an ISMS aligned with 27001 with Cyber Essentials Plus. So 27001 is very impactful and strategic, but the number of certificates is absolutely tiny. And so, but everyone goes, well, do I get SOC 2 or 27001? Or do I get Cyber Essentials? But they don't go, shall I get the security one for transport? Shall I get the security one for energy? Shall I get the security one for whatever? Because they're going, well, let's get 27,000. There's a brand recognition in the marketplace, which I think your accountability framework has achieved. Fantastic. So coming into the sort of closing bits, what 3 things would you like to say to people who are looking at using the accountability framework for the first time?
That's a good question. I would say, well, first of all, I say don't be scared. Yeah. Get stuck in, pick it up, have a look at it. It's there as a tool for people to use, adapt, and adopt. I think I would encourage it to be used internally in as kind of transparent and as open a way as you can, and internally to be honest about where your position is in terms of a journey towards the very best privacy management practice. And the other thing, I'll just stick this in as a third, is if you have got particular case studies of where organizations have been using it, we're always interested to add them. So we've got a bit on our website where people who've made use of the accountability framework can, if they want to, can let us know, and we can work with them if we think it's if it's all okay to develop further case studies on how it's being used. So we're always looking to get feedback and think about how we develop it in the future.
Well, I think you might get a few off the back of this conversation then, because I can think of a few people I'm going to call up after this to say, look, you want to get, because also this is the other bit about accountability. It's supporting business. If you can, if a business says, look, we're a case study on the ICO website, from my side of the fence, if a business goes, look, we're a case study on the ICO website, that's fantastic confirmation or value to say to people looking at doing business with the organization that we know what we're doing about privacy. So I imagine you'll get a flood of case study requests after that one. And so this has been really fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been really great. And thank you for answering all the questions, even the impertinent ones there. And any other
not at all. It's fine.
And any other sort of closing thought on the accountability framework as a whole?
We continue to be really interested to understand more about how it's going down, in inverted commas, out there, and how people are using it, both its strengths and its weaknesses. So realistically, I think that's probably the most important thing for me, is if there are things that we need to consider as we're developing it in the future, let us know, let us at ICO know, because that's how we'll be able to develop it, particularly as we think about the impact of legislative reform, as we look at how people have been working with it over a year or so since it's been out and published. Yeah, always keen to hear more feedback on how it's going.
Fantastic. So obviously people, how do they give you that feedback?
That's a very good question. So we have an ICO inbox for the accountability framework. If people drop an email to accountability@ico.org.uk, then that will go to an inbox, and we're interested to hear what people's comments, feedback. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And also if you're watching this video, do feel free to put comments in the YouTube channel as well on this video, and we can gather those as well if you don't feel like sending them to the ICO and going on the radar. But they're very friendly, as you see. So accountability.ico.org.uk. You can also put comments on the video here, and that's all public for everyone can see. It's a really good conversation. So, Chris, just remains for me to thank you very much. People can, you've given fantastic answers. Thank you very much. And also how people can contact the accountability team, and again, comments on here. So thank you very much for being a guest chef on Piracy Kitchen.
No problem. Always good to talk about these things.
Thank you very much.